She was 22 years old and had nothing to her name but a canvas bag, a wool coat with a torn lining, and $3 that her uncle had pressed into her palm, like he was paying a debt he was glad to be rid of. No family left to speak of, no address, no plan that reached past the end of the week. And with those $3, she bought a forgotten mill cottage on the edge of the Gatineau Hills that had not seen a fire in its hearth for 14 years. But what no one in the village knew, what she herself would not understand until the ice broke on the creek and the mud thawed and she finally worked up the nerve to pull up the loose flagstone in the back corner of the kitchen, was that someone had hidden something there, something that was never meant to be taken, only found. And what was written inside it would change the shape of everything that came after. We think you'll want to hear this one all the way through. Stay with us. Her name was Constance Vaille, and she was born in the winter of 1887 in a low-ceilinged farmhouse outside Wakefield, Quebec, the only child of a French-Canadian mother and a Scottish father who had come to the Ottawa Valley to work timber and stayed because of a woman and a piece of land, and later, because of Constance herself. Her father, Hugh Vaille, was a cooper by trade. He made barrels, flour barrels, salt barrels, whiskey barrels, and the farmers and merchants of the valley trusted him because his staves never warped and his hoops never slipped, and he never shorted a customer on volume. He was not a man who spoke much, but the things he built said everything his voice did not. Her mother, Celeste Sest, had been a school teacher before her marriage. She kept teaching after it, unofficially, to anyone who came to the kitchen table with a question. The house smelled of cedar shavings and ink, and the particular clean cold of a Quebec winter pressing through the window frames. Constance grew up understanding that useful things were honorable things. You did not spend your hands on what didn't matter. You learned the work in front of you, and you did it well, and you did not complain about the doing. Her father taught her to work wood when she was old enough to hold a draw knife, first simple joints, then mortise and tenon, then the patient curved geometry of a barrel stave. He taught her to read grain He taught her to read grain and follow it, to feel with her fingertips where the wood wanted to split and where it would hold. He taught her that the quality of a thing you made with your hands was the most honest statement you could make about yourself, because you couldn't talk your way around a barrel that leaked. She was 15 when her mother died of a fever that came in February and did not leave. After that, it was just the two of them, Hugh and Constance, and the shop behind the house, and the smell of cedar, and the sound of the creek that ran along the property's eastern edge, and a quiet that was not lonely exactly, but that had a particular weight to it, the weight of a name that no longer got called from the other room. Hugh Vaille died in the spring of 1907, when Constance was 19. He had gone out in early March to check the ice on the creek before the thaw, the way he always did, and the ice was not what he expected, and the creek was. They found him that afternoon. He was 54 years old. Constance stood at the edge of the water for a long time before she went to get the neighbors, and she did not cry until she was back inside the house with the door closed, and then she cried for a long time in the shop, surrounded by the smell of his tools and the half-finished barrel he had been working on that was still sitting in the shaving horse, waiting. The neighbors helped with the burial. The minister said the right words, and then a man named Roland Vaille, her father's younger brother, whom Constance had met perhaps 6 times in her life and did not especially like, arrived from Ottawa with papers that her father had apparently signed years before, in a period of debt and difficulty that Hugh had never spoken of to Constance. The papers gave Roland the right to the property in the event of Hugh's death if certain conditions were not met. The conditions had not been met because Hugh had never told Constance they existed. Roland Vaille was 50 years old, with a city solicitor's soft hands and a way of explaining things that made you feel the explanation was a courtesy he wasn't strictly required to offer. He was not cruel, he simply had no interest in her. He gave her 2 weeks to clear her things from the house, told her she could keep the tools that were small enough to carry, and said he would put the property up for sale as soon as the estate was settled. He gave her $3 and the name of a rooming house in Hull where she might find work in the textile mill. She did not go to Hull. She packed her canvas bag with her clothes and her mother's dictionary and her father's best draw knife, a tool with a beech handle, worn dark by decades of his hands, the blade thin from years of sharpening, still holding an edge that could shave the hair from your forearm. And she walked out of the house she had been born in and did not look back. Not because she was not grieving. She was. But grief had a direction to it, and the direction was forward, and she understood that standing still would not bring back anything that was already gone. The person who had shaped her most outside her parents was not a relative. She was a woman named Sibylle Tremblay, who lived alone in a stone house 3 miles up the creek road, and who had been at various points in her 70 years a midwife, a herbalist, a gilder, and a reader of everything she could get her hands on. Sibylle had no formal credentials and an unofficial reputation in the valley as a woman who knew more than was convenient and said so more often than was polite. Constance had first knocked on her door at the age of 12, carrying a piece of chair she had broken, while trying to repair it and did not know how to fix. Sibylle had looked at the break, looked at Constance, and said, "Come back Thursday with the right glue and I'll show you." Constance had come back every Thursday for 7 years. Sibylle taught her joinery beyond what her father knew. Dovetails, splines, the particular discipline of fitting 2 pieces of wood so cleanly that the joint disappeared. She taught her to read a building's bones, to understand why a floor sagged and a wall leaned, and a chimney smoked when the wind came from the east. She taught her to keep a kitchen garden in the short northern season, and to put up preserves, and to render lard, and to make a poultice from yarrow, and to splint a broken finger with 2 sticks and a strip of linen. She taught her to read maps and survey lines and to understand what the shape of the land was telling you about water and drainage, and where things would grow and where they would drown. Sibylle Tremblay died in January of 1908, very quietly, in her chair by the fire, with a book open in her lap and her tea gone cold on the table beside her. She left Constance her set of marking gauges, 6 of them, ranging from a fine inlay gauge to a heavy mortise gauge, each one made of rosewood with a brass thumbscrew, each one perfectly calibrated, and a small journal filled with notes in Sibylle's dense, cramped handwriting about wood and plants and buildings, and the particular logic of things that lasted. Constance carried the marking gauges in her bag wrapped in a piece of flannel, and she carried the journal inside her coat where it stayed warm. And these 2 things, along with her father's draw knife, were the entirety of what she owned that mattered. Not money, not a name that opened doors. Knowledge, made into objects that fit her hands, and the memory of 2 people who had looked at her squarely and believed she was enough. The morning she left Wakefield for good was the last Thursday of March, 1908. The snow was still deep in the shadows of the tree lines, but the road was bare and the air smelled of mud and the particular sweetness of sap beginning to move in the maples. She walked north, because north was where the road went that was not the road to Hull. She walked for 2 days. The first night she slept in a cedar log barn outside a small farm near Kazabazua, burrowed into loose hay with her coat pulled tight and her bag as a pillow, listening to the horses shift and breathe in the dark and feeling, for the first time since she had stood at the edge of the creek, watching the men pull her father out of the water, something that was not grief or anger, but a strange, scoured emptiness, like a vessel that had been emptied and was waiting to be filled with something that was not sorrow. The second day she followed the Gatineau River north until she reached a settlement called Point Bleu, which was not much. A general store, a sawmill, a church with a tin roof, and a scatter of houses along the river road. She was hungry, and her boots were wet, and she had not spoken to anyone in 30 hours, which was long enough to make the sound of other people's voices feel almost startling. The store was run by a man named Ernest Cadieux, who was 68 years old, and had the specific calmness of someone who had been watching people come and go for 4 decades, and had stopped being surprised by either arrival or departure. Constance bought a tin of saltfish and a bag of oats with 50 cents of her $3, and asked whether there was work in the area for someone who could do joinery and coopering and basic carpentry. Ernest Cadieux looked at her for a long time, at her boots, which were worn but recently oiled, at her hands, which were calloused across the inner fingers in exactly the way a person's hands get calloused from working a draw knife, and he said, "Depends what you're willing to live in." She told him she was willing to live in anything with a roof and 4 walls, and a floor that didn't go through to the ground. He set his hands on the counter and said there was a place up the creek, about 5 miles east along the logging road, that had been sitting empty since before the war, and the land company that owned it on paper had been trying to offload it for years, and the last asking price he had heard mentioned was $3, which was not a price for a building, but a price for the paperwork to go away. The place was called the Duplessis Mill Cottage. It had been, before the timber ran out in that particular stand of forest, a cooper's workshop and residence combined. A small squared timber building of 1 story and a half loft, set beside a fast-moving creek that had once powered a small sawmill. The mill itself long since collapsed into a heap of mossy timbers in the water. The cottage was perhaps 30 feet by 20, with a sleeping loft above and a large main room below that had served as both kitchen and workshop, and a separate root cellar built into the hill behind it, its door hanging open to the elements for God knew how long. Constance walked the property the afternoon Ernest Cadieux told her about it, following the logging road east through birch forest still, gray and bare from winter until she heard the creak and then followed the sound. The building emerged from the trees the way old things emerge. Slowly, in pieces, first the stone chimney visible through the birches, then the roof line, then the whole of it, small and square and gray with weather. The roof was cedar shingle and badly wanted redoing along the north slope, where the ice had worked under the shingles and lifted them and let several winters' worth of water into the loft. The squared timber walls were sound. White pine, inch and a half thick, dovetailed at the corners with a precision that told her the man who had built it had known his craft. The chinking between the timbers had fallen out in places and the wind came through, but the timbers themselves had not moved. The floor was wide pine boards, dark with age and gritty, with years of leaf fall blown in through the broken window, but solid. She walked every inch of it, and none of it gave. The fireplace was field stone, assembled without mortar in the old Quebec way, just stone laid on stone with gravity doing the work, and it had held. The cooking crane was gone. The iron bar that had mounted it was still bolted to the firebox wall, one bolt loose, one solid. The chimney drew. She built a small fire from birch bark and dead branches she found at the tree line, and the smoke went straight up without hesitation, which told her the flue was clear and the draw was good. In the corner of the main room, near the back wall, one flagstone was slightly out of alignment with the others. It was a larger stone than its neighbors, pale gray granite, with a faint pink vein running diagonally across it, and it sat perhaps a quarter-inch higher on one side than the other, as though it had been lifted and replaced and not quite seated back the way it had been. Constance noticed it the way her father had taught her to notice things. Not by looking for it, but by letting her eyes rest on the floor without a particular target, the way you let your eyes rest on a piece of wood to find the grain before you start cutting. She pressed on the raised edge with her boot. There was a faint give, not much, just enough to tell her there was a void beneath. She went back to Ernest Cadieux's store that afternoon and told him she wanted the property. He got out a deed of transfer, old and water-stained at one corner, and wrote up the transaction in his careful hand. And Constance laid her $3 silver on the counter. The $3 Roland Vaille had given her as the full accounting of her worth to him, and signed her name, and the Duplessis Mill cottage and the 4 acres surrounding it were hers. She had no money left. She had her bag, her coat, her father's draw knife, Sybil Tremblay's marking gauges, Sybil's journal, and her mother's dictionary. She had a tin of saltfish and a bag of oats. And she had a flagstone in the corner of a room that she had not yet found the nerve to lift. She carried her bag up the logging road in the last light of the afternoon. The creek loud beside her, and the birches just beginning to show the faintest blur of green at their tips where the buds were thinking about opening. She walked through the doorway of the cottage and set her bag down on the pine floor and stood in the silence and listened to the creek and the wind in the trees outside and the distant, patient sound of a place that had been waiting a long time for someone to come back to it. She lit a fire in the fieldstone fireplace using the last of the birch bark and built it up carefully with birch splits and a piece of dry pine she found stacked under the eave on the south side of the building, left there by someone a long time ago, still good. The fire caught, and the room filled with light and the smell of wood smoke, and the particular smell of an old house that has been cold for a long time and is beginning to remember what warmth is. She ate her salt fish cold from the tin and drank water from the creek and slept that night on the floor, with her coat over her and her bag beneath her head, and she did not dream, which was itself a kind of rest she had not had since February. She lived that way for the first 2 weeks. She bought oats and salt pork and dried beans from Ernest Cadieux's store, paying carefully from the small reserve of coins she had carried through in the seams of her bag, money she had put by over years of small earnings from taking in, mending and finishing carpentry work for neighbors in Wakefield. Money Roland Vaille had not known to look for. She was not wealthy. She had enough to work with if she was careful. On the 12th day she came back to the flagstone. She had been telling herself she was waiting until the light was right, until she had settled in enough, until she was ready. She understood, in the clear-eyed way she understood most things about herself, that she was also afraid. afraid that there was nothing beneath it, and the small hope she had been carrying, since she first felt it shift under her boot, would prove to be nothing more than a settling of the foundation. Afraid, in a different and less logical way, that there would be something, and that whatever it was would ask something of her she did not know how to give. She knelt on the floor, in the mid-morning light, and worked the tip of a flat screwdriver, bought from Ernest Cadieux for 5 cents, along the edge of the stone, clearing the grit and debris that had packed itself into the joint over years. The stone was heavy, perhaps 40 pounds, but when she worked the screwdriver under the raised edge and leaned her weight on it, the stone came up more readily than a stone that had never been moved should have come up. Someone had lifted it before. Deliberately, carefully, and more than once. Beneath it was not packed earth. It was a cavity, perhaps 16 inches across and 10 inches deep, lined on the sides with flat shale set on edge and on the bottom with a piece of oilcloth folded in on itself, stiff with age but intact, sealed by the cold and the dark into a shape as precise as the day it had been placed there. Constance sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. The creek ran outside. A woodpecker worked at a dead birch somewhere close by. The fire had burned down to coals and the room was quiet and still, and full of pale March light. She lifted the oilcloth out and carried it to the window and set it on the workbench that ran along the south wall, the original joiner's bench, solid as the building itself, with a leg vise at one end that still turned smoothly if you put your weight into it. And she unfolded it. Inside were 3 things. The first was a cloth pouch drawn shut with a braided cord. It had the weight and the faint musical sound of coins. The second was a small rectangular tin, the kind that had once held tobacco, its lid pressed shut. Something inside it shifted when she tilted it. Something solid and light. The third was a letter, folded in thirds and sealed with a drop of red wax that had darkened to the color of old brick, but had not cracked. She opened the cloth pouch first. Inside were coins, not silver but gold. Canadian $20 gold pieces, the kind with the king's profile on one side and the Dominion arms on the other. She counted them with hands that were not quite steady. There were 11, $220 in gold, which was more than her father had earned in a year of coopering, more than Roland Vaille kept in his office safe, more than Constance had ever held or expected to hold or had dared to imagine. She set the coins on the oilcloth in a single careful row and opened the tobacco tin. Inside, resting on a nest of cotton batting gone yellow with age, was a compass. Not a surveyor's compass but a pocket compass, small enough to fit in a closed fist, its brass case engraved on the back with a pattern of intertwined leaves, and in the center of the pattern, 2 initials, PD. The glass over the face was unbroken. The needle swung freely and settled precisely on north. It was the kind of object that is worth almost nothing by the standards of a jeweler, and everything by the standards of a person who understands that some things are kept not for their value, but for what they mean. She held it in her palm for a moment. The brass was cold, and then, slowly, warm. She set it down beside the coins and picked up the letter. She broke the wax and unfolded the paper. It was good stock, the kind used for legal purposes. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the pen pressure even. The letters formed with the patience of someone who wrote slowly, because they wanted the words to mean exactly what they said. It read, "My name is Philippa Dorval, and I am writing this on the 6th of November, 1893, in the cottage that my husband Gilles and I built together in the summer of 1871, the year we came up the creek road from Maniwaki with our tools and our tent and a plan that everyone we knew thought was foolishness. Gilles has been gone for 3 years now. He went the way men go when they have worked hard all their lives, and the body decides it is finished before the mind agrees. I am 64 years old and I am alone in this cottage, which was built for 2 people and has felt that way since the morning I woke up and he was not in it. I am writing this because I am going to leave, not because I want to. I have lived here for 22 years, and there is not a board or a stone in this building that my hands have not touched. But my daughter in Montreal has been asking me to come, and I am tired in a way that sleep does not fix. And I know the difference between a tiredness you can rest through and one that is asking you to stop and listen. So I am going south, and I do not expect to come back, and I cannot carry what I am leaving here. And I will not leave it to be found by people who would not know what it was. The money in the pouch is what Gilles and I put by over 22 years of working this land, and the timber on it, and the mill, when the mill still ran, and the coopering after the mill stopped. We were never wealthy. But Gilles said every year that if you put something aside before you counted what was left, eventually you would have something. And he was right, and this is what we have. I had meant to give it to my daughter, but she has married a man who is comfortable, and she does not need it, and I think she would find it strange that I kept it under a stone and not in a bank, which is a way of thinking I have never shared. The compass belonged to Gilles. He carried it every day, from the time he was 16 until the day he died, and then I carried it. And now I am placing it in this tin and putting the tin in this hole and pressing the stone back into place. And I will tell you that this is one of the hardest things I have done, and I have done a number of hard things. To whoever finds this, I don't know who you are or when you'll come, or what brought you to this cottage, but if you lifted this stone, you were looking for something. Maybe you knew it was here, maybe you didn't. Either way, I think you have need of what's underneath it. Take it. Take all of it. Use the money to fix what is broken, and plant what has gone bare, and make this cottage a working place again. That is all I ask. That someone work here. That someone light a fire in that fireplace, and run a plane across a board in that shop, and walk down to the creek in the morning to see what the night brought in. Gilles and I were content here. More than content. This was a good life and a good place, and it deserves better than to stand empty, while the shingles lift, and the chinking falls out, and the floor gets cold. I hope you find what you're looking for. I hope this helps you find it. Philippa Dorval, written in her own hand in the cottage her husband built, on a gray November morning with snow coming in from the north. Constance read the letter twice. Then she read it a third time, and on the third reading, her vision blurred, and she set it down on the workbench, and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, and stayed very still for a long time, looking out the window at the creek, and the birches, and the gray-white sky above them. She did not cry dramatically. She cried the way you cry when you have been carrying something very heavy for a long time, and someone you have never met and will never meet, someone who has been dead for years, reaches out of the past and takes part of the weight. Quietly, with a gratitude that had no adequate words, only a physical feeling in the chest, like a window being opened in a room that has been closed all winter. She did not spend the gold quickly. She had grown up watching her father account for every cent, and she understood. In her bones, that money was not for spending all at once but for building something with, the way you build a barrel. One stave at a time, each one fitted carefully before the next one goes in. The whole thing useless until it is complete. She went to Ernest Cadieux the next morning and bought flour and oats and salt pork and a box of cut nails and 2 panes of glass and a coil of rope and a bar of soap and a paper of tea. And she paid with 1 gold coin and accepted her change in paper and silver, and felt the particular strangeness of being a person who could purchase what she needed without calculating whether the purchase would mean going hungry. She told Ernest about the cottage, about the roof and the chinking and the floor, not about the letter, not about the gold, just the work. He listened with his hands on the counter, and then said there was a man named Théodore Archambault, who had done carpentry in the valley for 40 years, and whose hands still knew the work, even if his knees didn't love ladders anymore, and that she should talk to him about the shingles, before the spring melt finished what the ice had started. Théodore Archambault was 67 years old, with a white mustache and hands that were so scarred and squared off from a lifetime of tools that they looked less like hands than like 2 tools themselves. He came to the property on a Tuesday morning, walked around the outside without speaking, went inside, came back out, looked at the north roof slope for a long time, and said, "Cedar shake, I can get good cedar from the Beauchamp mill. You'll need a helper to pass shingles." She told him she would be the helper. He looked at her the way Ernest Cadieux had looked at her. That measuring look, not unfriendly, just honest. Then he nodded and said, "We start when the frost is out of the ground." They started on the 1st of May, when the ground was soft enough to be safe, but the mud had dried from the roof. Théodore showed her how to strip the old shingles from the bottom course up, working a flat bar under each one and letting it drop to the ground, and how to examine the sheathing boards beneath for rot and replace what had to be replaced before a single new shingle went on. He showed her how to lay new shingles in offset courses, each one nailed with 2 nails set well from the edge, each course overlapping the one below by the right amount, not more, not less. He talked while he worked, in a way that was less like instruction than like thinking aloud. During the 10 days they worked on the roof, she learned things about Théodore Archambault. That he had built his own house at 24. With lumber, he had milled himself from trees. He had cut himself on land. He had bought himself with 3 years of wages from a lumber camp. That he had had 6 children, of whom 4 were living, scattered from Ottawa to Vancouver Island. That he had built 31 structures in the Gatineau Valley, and could identify the work of most of the other carpenters in the region by the way they cut their joints. That he carried a folded paper in his shirt pocket that was a drawing his youngest daughter had made of their house when she was 6 years old. A crayon drawing with a too large chimney and a sun with 8 rays, and he touched it sometimes, without seeming to know he was doing it. On the 4th day of the roof work, a woman appeared at the edge of the logging road with a basket over her arm. Her name was Georgette Labelle. She was 55 years old and lived with her husband Aurel on a farm about a mile north, and she had a face that seemed constitutionally incapable of anything except warmth and mild impatience. She set the basket on the workbench inside the door and said, "Théodore told me there was a young woman fixing up the old Duplessis place. I thought you might be running short of food." The basket had a pot of pea soup and a loaf of bread and a paper of butter. She did not wait for thanks. She came back 2 days later with a crock of maple butter and a bundle of seed onions and a length of advice about which way to face the kitchen garden to get the most of the short northern season. Her husband Aurel came with her the following week. He was 62, short and broad and nearly silent, with the patient look of a man who had spent 40 years doing what needed doing without requiring anyone to notice. He walked around the outside of the cottage, examined the foundation, and said, "Your sill log on the north side is going soft. You want me to bring my jack?" She told him she did. He came back the next morning with a hydraulic jack and 2 lengths of timber and a neighbor named Fernand Gagnon, who said nothing at all but worked steadily for 4 hours, and together the 3 of them lifted the north wall 3 inches, pulled the rotted sill, fitted a new one cut from a green tamarack log Fernand had dropped and hauled from his woodlot the previous afternoon, and set the wall back down on it. When it was done, the north wall was square and true, in a way it probably had not been in 20 years. A man named Joachim Paré, who ran the Point Bleu sawmill, appeared one morning with a bundle of seasoned pine boards and said he was paying a debt. He told her that Philippa Dorval's husband Gilles had given his father a season's worth of shingles in the winter of 1888, when the Paré mill burned down, and there was no money to rebuild, and no shingles to sell, and 5 children in the house. He said he had been paying that debt back slowly for 20 years, and had been looking for the right person to pay it to. He set the boards against the cottage wall and left before she could say much more than thank you. A woman named Marguerite Couture, who kept 20 beehives on the south slope above the creek, came by one afternoon to say she had a swarm that had absconded from one of her hives and taken up residence in a hollow ash tree at the edge of Constance's property, and she thought Constance might want it if she had any interest in bees. She did. She had helped Sibylle Tremblay with her hives for years. Marguerite lent her an old veil, and together they boxed the swarm on a warm May evening, Marguerite talking quietly the whole time the way you talk to bees, which is the way you talk to anything you want to trust you. Each person who came brought something specific and left without making a ceremony of it, and Constance began to understand, in the way you understand things you have always half known, that this was what community was, not a feeling but a practice, a set of small acts done steadily, over time, in the knowledge that someday the direction of the acts would reverse, and then reverse again. And that was how people survived in a place where the winters were long and the ground was hard and no one could manage entirely alone. The weeks gathered into months. Constance re-chinked the walls from the outside, working from top to bottom, troweling a mix of clay and sand and dried moss into each joint and smoothing it flush with the timber face. She reglazed the 2 windows with glass she ordered from Ernest Cadieux, setting each pane in putty she made herself from linseed oil and chalk dust, the way Sibylle Tremblay had written in her journal it should be done. She repaired the cooking crane with a new hook she forged in a small fire she built in the yard, using a piece of wagon iron and a flat stone for an anvil and her father's draw knife to clean and shape the metal once it cooled. She rehung it on the iron bar in the firebox and boiled water on it that evening, and drank tea and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing returned to its purpose. She cleared the kitchen garden in June, turning the soil with a mattock she borrowed from Aurel Labelle, and planted what Georgette had suggested, beans and potatoes and carrots and turnips and a long row of onions and a corner of dill that grew faster than she expected, and smelled like her mother's kitchen in August. She staked the beans and hilled the potatoes, and watered from the creek with a yoke she made from a piece of ash that Théodore helped her shape, and she watched things grow with an attention that was not patience exactly, but something quieter than urgency. An understanding that growth happened according to its own schedule, and your job was to make the conditions right, and then get out of the way. She set up the beehive against the south wall of the cottage, where it would catch the morning sun, and she tended it wearing Marguerite Couture's borrowed veil, which smelled of wood smoke and beeswax, and the particular dusty sweetness of something old and well-used. The bees worked the clover along the creek bank and the wildflowers at the tree line, and came home every evening heavy and purposeful. And she watched them, and felt something she recognized as kinship. She set up her workbench properly. The original bench was good. She had cleaned it and tuned the leg vise and replaced the bench stop, and she began taking joinery work. First for Theodore, who sent her small jobs he didn't want to bend over for, door repairs and window sashes, and a cedar blanket chest for a woman in the village whose daughter was getting married. Then, as the summer wore on, and the quality of her work became known the way things become known in small places, slowly, and without announcement for other people, she charged fair prices and delivered what she promised, and did not cut corners where corners could be seen. And the farmers, and the merchants of Point Bleu, and the small settlements up and down the creek road began to come to her the way they had come to her father, because she was good, and because she was honest, and because something in the quality of her work said, clearly and without words, that the person who made this cared about the making. By the time the first frost came in September, the cottage was tight and warm and furnished with the things she had made. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a rope spring and a mattress stuffed with cattail down, shelves along the north wall for her tools and her books, and Philippa Dorval's tobacco tin with its compass inside. The flagstone was back in the floor, seated level and solid, on a vase of rubble and mortar she had packed carefully into the cavity. There was nothing hidden beneath it now, except a foundation she had built herself. On an evening in late September, when the maples had gone red, and the birches gold, and the creek was running fast and cold, with the first rains of autumn, Constance sat in the chair she had made from birch and hickory bark and ash, in front of the fieldstone fireplace, with a small fire going. The window was open an inch, and the air came in cold and clean, with the smell of fallen leaves and the creek. Sibylle Tremblay's journal was in her lap, open to a page about wood movement and seasonal change, though she was not reading it. She was looking at the mantel. On the mantel were 4 things. Her father's draw knife, cleaned and oiled, and hanging on 2 wooden pegs she had cut and fitted into the stone. Sibylle Tremblay's marking gauges, the rosewood dark and warm in the firelight. The letter from Philippa Dorval, folded and tucked inside the tobacco tin. And the compass, which she had taken out of the tin and set on the mantelpiece where she could see it. The needle sitting still and pointing north the way it always did, the brass worn smooth by a man's hands over a lifetime of carrying. 4 objects. 4 people who had built things and lost things and left behind in the things they made and the words they wrote and the tools they chose to pass on. A kind of instruction that could not be given any other way. Her father, who had taught her that the work you put into something was the most honest thing you could say about yourself. Sibylle Tremblay, who had taught her that a woman who could build and mend and grow and heal was a woman no one could make smaller than she was. Philippa Dorval, who had pressed her savings and her compass and her faith in a stranger under a stone, in a room where a fire was now burning. And Gilles Dorval, who she knew only from a compass needle pointing north and a woman's letter. And who had built this room well enough that it was still standing 60 years after he had put the last peg in. She thought about Roland Vaille, her father's brother, who had handed her $3 silver and the name of a textile mill, and considered the matter settled. She found that she could think about him without the particular heat that anger has, which was not forgiveness and not indifference, but something that had the quality of distance. The way you can look back at a mountain you have crossed and feel nothing except the knowledge that you are on the other side of it now. She did not think about what her life might have been if he had been a different kind of man. That was not a useful direction. The mind, she had decided, was like a workshop. It had a finite amount of space, and you chose what went in it, and whatever you put in it, you would eventually have to work around, and it was better to be deliberate about it. She looked at the fire, and the mantelpiece, and the tools on their pegs, and she listened to the creek, and the wind in the birches, and the sound of the bees, quiet now in their hive against the south wall, done for the season, and waiting out the cold. And she felt something she had not felt since she was 12 years old, sitting at Sibylle Tremblay's kitchen table, with a broken chair and a question and nowhere else to go. The feeling of being in the right place. Not the place she had expected, not the place that had been given to her, because nothing here had been given. but the place she had found and paid for, and fixed and filled, board by board and nail by nail and stave by stave, until it fit her, the way a good tool fits the hand that has learned it. We have told this story because we think you know something of what it holds. Not the cottage, maybe, and not the Gatineau Hills, and probably not the particular weight of a Canadian autumn settling over river birch and red maple. But the rest of it, the thing you were given that was meant to diminish you and did not. The knowledge you carry that no one can take back. The place, maybe not a building, maybe not a place at all. Maybe a practice, a skill, a way of being in the world, that felt like nothing until you stood inside it and understood, for the first time in a long time, that it knew your name. Constance Vaille was 22 years old when her uncle handed her $3 silver and the address of a mill in Hull, and closed the door of her father's house behind her. She walked north. She spent those $3 on a forgotten cottage in the hills above a creek she had never heard of, a building with a soft sill and a lifted stone in the kitchen floor, and 14 years of cold inside its walls. She was not looking for treasure when she lifted that stone. She was looking for a void in the foundation. What she found instead was the savings of a life, and a compass, and a letter from a woman who had loved a place enough to ask a stranger to make it live again. It was the best $3 she ever spent. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need it today. And we'd like to ask you something before you go. What is the thing in your own life? The forgotten skill, the closed door, the small tool you've been carrying without knowing why. That might be waiting for someone to lift the stone.